But there were just a few bits that you hear about Richard that frankly get on my nerves.
Lovely.
So we talked about, so a lot of people know this, what I tend to do is exactly what I've done with you today. I go, come, we're going to do this interview an hour later, and we're talking about everything else we've talked about before. And as you said yourself earlier, there are so many things we just don't know, and unfortunately we probably never will know. But it's interesting to hypothesize and widen our mindset, and that's why it's important to look at the theory like that you've proffered here, that there's two Edwards, and actually there is a possibility that one was passed off as another because it was just easier, and it was easy to hide the evidence later on. But there are just these few odd things, and the one for me, some people know I am a Pilates instructor, but is the scoliosis. And I've heard this said, Richard must have been in enormous pain, and there probably was times when, you know, back problems, if you've ever been a victim of a back problem, it's horrible. So definitely I feel that there must have been times when he was extremely uncomfortable and suffering. But as a result of this definite agony that he must have been in 24/7, that made him cruel and angry and tyrannical. I know people with scoliosis, okay? And then you look at somebody like Dominic Smee. If people don't know who Dominic Smee is, there was a brilliant documentary made about him, I think by Channel 4. And unfortunately, you can't get the whole documentary anywhere. I keep looking for it. But Dominic had a scoliosis practically identical to Richard's. And so obviously there was things that Dominic has struggled with over time. And they worked with him and got him horse riding, and obviously it was difficult for him. He'd never ridden a horse before, to be fair to this young chap, and wielding a sword, you know, and these are difficult things anyway for anybody. But what they did was they got Dominic a horse with like a medieval saddle on it, and made him a set of armour to fit him, which is obviously, as the upper class at the top here, that's what you had. And when he was in that situation, he said himself, this is just a completely different situation. I am comfortable, I am supported, I can move. And that's what Richard would have had. Richard would have had the best of armour and everything like that. And he was very competent in battle. This was something that was stated from the outset. He did not struggle in battle. You know, he didn't go in awkwardly or have to retreat. You know, he went in and he went in. And I take great umbrage to, well, because he had scoliosis, he must have been in pain. Yes, he very possibly was, but that made him some really terrible, horrible person. And I think when you reflect on that, there aren't accounts of, you know, people say, oh, Henry VIII was in pain and it could make him quite crotchety, but there's kind of accounts of that. Again, that is a bit of a, you know, a bit of a, oh, well, maybe we've said that about Henry VIII, and actually it was the insecurity and it was this, it wasn't just the fact, but he was in pain with his leg. It must have been horrible. But I don't remember reading contemporary sources or anything, obviously I'm not as well read as you, but that say, you know, Richard was in the council meeting, and he was in pain and he stormed out, or Richard was constantly laid up in agony, or anything like that.
No, and I think this is again an effort to make the fact that we know now that he had scoliosis kind of fit the caricature that we want of Richard as this evil, bad-tempered monster. You know, he was having a bit of a twinge in his back, so I'll go and kill some children. It doesn't quite work like that. I mean, back pain is nasty, but it's never made me want to kill some children. You know, Usain Bolt has got scoliosis. Fastest man on the planet, and one of the nicest men on the planet. You know, I've seen footage of him before his races, you know, going and high-fiving the people behind the starting blocks, and it kind of makes their day. It's just a condition that you live with. And Richard grew up, he probably developed this in his early teens. So he grew up with this. And yes, I don't doubt for a second there were times when it was painful and uncomfortable. But he also trained, you know, he did well in battle because he trained around his scoliosis. He built muscle to compensate for any problems that it caused him. Dominic Smee, one of the things that he struggled with was lung capacity. But you know, he hadn't trained all of his life to build that kind of athletic ability to be on the battlefield. It's a specific kind of training that Richard had been undergoing with scoliosis for 15, 16, 17 years by the time he gets to Bosworth. So he is used to dealing with all of this. And there's no evidence in the decade or so that he's in the north that people found him crotchety and difficult to deal with. And if you catch him on a bad day, you're liable to lose your head. There's just absolutely none of that. So to think that it suddenly, in 1483, it suddenly became a problem for him is kind of ridiculous.
And also with the way that people dress, especially noblemen who had the money for all these layers, and in the north, I'm going to say awful stereotype, it's always cold in the north, especially with someone from down south, it's always cold in the north, like me. A lot of the people wouldn't have known a huge amount about Richard as an individual, especially the lower echelons of society. He was this chap, and a lot of them may never even have heard of him. They wouldn't have even known much about Edward himself as king. And when he was dressed, a lot of people, you may not have even been able to see the fact that his back wasn't straight and he was a little bit maybe rounded to one side.
The lack of contemporary comment on his uneven shoulders is probably a hint that he was pretty good at hiding it in his tailoring, and of having fairly bulky doublets and things like that made it appear that he had even shoulders. So if you looked at him, you wouldn't think something's off or awry with that. So the vast majority of people probably never had any clue that there was anything wrong with Richard. There's probably a handful of close servants who saw him with his shirt off in the mornings and things like that would obviously know what was going on, and family would know what was going on. But for the vast majority of people, it just wouldn't be something that they would have known about him at all. There seems to be a bit of shock in the reports you get at Bosworth. His body's stripped and thrown over a horse, and that's probably the first time the vast majority of people have ever seen that he had any kind of problem with his back. So there's a kind of level of shock that you might get there, which suggests again that people didn't already know this, because otherwise they wouldn't have been surprised to have discovered this at Bosworth. It's definitely a part of what makes up Richard, but I don't think it makes him a monster. People live with scoliosis today, and they're not horrible monsters. And having grown up with it, it maybe didn't have as much of an impact as some people think it did on Richard's life and on his performance on the battlefield and all of that kind of thing. I often wonder how much it plays into his psychology, because at a time when people quite often equated physical disabilities with a corruption of the soul. So not always, but having a physical disability makes you a bad person, an evil person. It's kind of an outward manifestation of the corruption of your soul. People didn't always think that, but it was a fairly prevalent view. So as Richard starts to develop scoliosis at the age of 13, 14, 15, he's not only dealing with the physical aspects of what that's doing to him and probably trying to hide it from people, but he has to be concerned about, what does this mean that God thinks of me?
Oh, that's horrible.
Do I have a corrupt soul because my body's behaving this way? He has to think that about himself, and he has to think that about other people. So maybe the reason he hides it so well for his entire life is because he knows it's ammunition for people to use against him. So if they find out that he has this deformed spine, quite severe twist and the uneven shoulders, they can use that against him to say that this is an outward manifestation of a man with a corrupt soul.
That's horrible.
So it's not even just the physical aspects of it. And I think when you get to 1483, again, this has to play into Richard's psychology. You're talking about a man who becomes King of England and undergoes a coronation ceremony and is anointed by God as King of England. Well, if you've spent your whole life looking for some form of approval,
that's the ultimate.
Doesn't get much better than that, does it?
I mean, people have said about that iconic portrait of Richard, and I can't remember if the shoulders looked uneven and then someone straightened them out, or if it was the other way around. But my kind of argument with the portraiture is, say somebody came in later and made them look more level to try and make Richard look better. Just say that happened. Or at the time, they were painted higher and then somebody put them back. Anybody with an ounce of sort of self-preservation is going to go in and paint the portrait that monarch wants them to paint.
Yeah,
You
and
know,
probably
you're not there. You're there to create an image of that person, but mostly about their face, their facial features, and then all the sort of the hidden meanings of the portraiture and the other information that you have. I don't know a massive amount about portraiture. It's a bit of a gap in my knowledge that I'd like to improve. But, you know, a portrait, it's more about the face, I
well,
think.
it's essentially it's your Instagram profile picture, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's your medieval Insta. It's a chance to say what you want to say about yourself.
It's just as much about what's in it to show, you know, the symbols of power
Yeah,
and you know what you had and who you were, as it is about what you physically look like.
yeah, and probably Richard would have no reason to say to the portrait artist, and by the way, I've got scoliosis and really uneven
Just
shoulders.
like that, yeah, because he
We
wouldn't
couldn't see
know.
it under his clothes anyway. He would have been wearing his finery for a portrait,
Yeah.
and he would just let the bloke paint him as he saw him. And so the scoliosis and the hunchback and the uneven shoulders thing is obviously, it was a surprise for Ricardians, I think, when his remains were found. And partly that's because of all of the evidence from the portrait. So we get evidence that the raised shoulder moves from one side to the other, that a raised shoulder was painted in later, that other shoulders were lower. But there's also lots of other evidence about Richard's features being changed on the painting. So his face is made narrower, his lips are made narrower to make him look more stern, and all that kind of thing. But, you know, the raised shoulders changing sides, you can kind of pass off. When portraits were done in those days, you do a template portrait that everyone uses. You know, you can kind of trace that, flip it over onto a piece of canvas, and you've drawn it the other way around.
Because they were always from the side. It wasn't really
Yeah,
till
so instead of looking right, you're looking left, and instead of that side being raised, that side's being raised.
Yeah.
It's just been transposed over like that. But definitely, you know, it was partly about Richard's reputation as well, because they've made his face look much more serious and stern than it was on the portrait. So I think it definitely, Ricardians thought that the raised shoulder thing was a myth, the hunchback thing was a myth, and there was evidence in those portraitures that they'd been changed and altered. You know, they were x-rayed, and you could see all of these changes that seemed to support the idea that these raised shoulders were added in later. And obviously that it turns out that they were actually correct, but there's no reason to think they would have been in the original portrait of Richard. I mean,
and also it's not like that. Do you know what I mean? It's just like, and also, you know, you don't know how people are sitting, you know, because the portraits tended to be from the side. I think it was more in Henry VIII's reign, where there's that iconic picture of him like, look at me, what an enormous chap I am.
Yeah.
And that's sort of from the front, isn't it? They're always to the side. And so that's also going to affect, if I turn like that, it doesn't look the same as when I'm sitting.
It only takes the artist not to be great at drawing perspective.
Yeah, and you see quite a lot of that in medieval painting, don't you? There's some great stuff that comes up. So yeah, so that's definitely something that's just one of my, I don't like that. I'm not having any of that sort of thing. Okay, now where am I? And then there was just the other things we're going to have to go through. These are a little bit shorter, I suppose, really, in terms of Richard's personal life. So the first one is with his marriage to Anne. You know, we were sort of talking about this earlier. Do we think, because there's this thing that he came in and he just went after her and it was convenient, and then he wasn't really that bothered about her, and then in the end he poisoned her to get rid of her because their son had passed away and needed to get rid of her and start again, basically. And I just don't feel that there's really sort of any evidence for them having a hostile relationship or a cold relationship, or that he did away with her. So where does this sort of come from, especially that he's poisoned her to get rid of her type of thing?
Yeah. Again, it's hard because, you know, we're talking about people's relationships from 500 years ago. So it's hard to know, as I don't believe that it was this kind of cold business-like match, but it's equally hard to say that it was a love match. You know, quite often in fiction and things, it's portrayed as the ultimate love match between the two of them. I think it's probably somewhere in the middle, a bit of both. It was good business and they happen to like each other, which is great. You know, that's all you can hope for in a medieval marriage. You know, and we talked about earlier, you know, it's often perceived as Richard hunting her down because she's such a great heiress and he wants to get his hands on the Warwick inheritance. But Anne is in such a position in 1471. She's been married to the Lancastrian Prince of Wales, and he's been killed at the Battle of Tewkesbury in 1471. And then she's effectively taken into the custody of her sister Isabel, who is married to George, Duke of Clarence, Richard's brother. And this is a fairly common tactic to stop her being able to claim her half of the inheritance. So George and Isabel get to keep it for themselves for as long as she remains unmarried. So I wonder whether, what we don't know is who makes first contact between Richard and Anne. So we're often given this image of Richard pursuing her and hunting her down to get his hands on the Warwick inheritance. But it may well be been at least as much the case that Anne was looking for, how does she secure her future? Where does she go from here? And if she's looking for someone who can rival George, Duke of Clarence, to be able to get access to her half of the Warwick inheritance, there's kind of only one unmarried man left in the kingdom that she could even consider turning to, and that's George's brother Richard. So there's no saying that she wasn't the one who reached out to him first, and said, you know, I'm a virtual prisoner here, save me. We know they knew each other from their childhood at Midland. There's at least one occasion where they sit at a banquet at the same table next to each other, and that's well documented. And you know, Richard spent a few years in Anne's father's household, so the chances are they were around each other a fair bit. Not to say that they fell in love as young children, but that they knew each other. And that perhaps if Anne's thinking, who can I turn to help me, to get me out of this predicament, actually Richard is the ideal person for her. You know, he could be looking at foreign matches to princesses that might bring him much more power on the continent than marrying Warwick's heiress and getting half of the Earl of Warwick's land is going to get him in England. But she's the one who actually benefits the most from marrying Richard, rather than him marrying her. So it's difficult to say that it's a love match, and I don't see anything cold in their relationship. They seem to have worked incredibly well. They were married. I mean, if they got married, we don't know exactly when they got married because we don't know anything, do we? Probably around 1472. She dies in early 1485. So 13 years of marriage. It seems to have been a pretty good, at least a good working relationship, fairly solid. They only have one child. We don't know the reason they only have one child. We don't know whether there were failed pregnancies or anything like that weren't recorded. And when that child passes away, the Crowland Chronicle records that they hear the news at Nottingham and that they're completely inconsolable, and that the two of them, you know, much the same as we get the story about Henry VII and Elizabeth of York when Arthur passes away. You know, they turn to each other for consolation, and that they are close enough that they're the person they want to be around in that crisis. The story that Richard poisoned Anne is interesting because it's contemporary. So Richard has to stand up in front of the people of London and effectively say that he hasn't murdered his wife, at the same time that he puts to bed another myth about his niece. So there must have been rumours around that Richard had done away with his wife. And I could talk for another couple of hours about this if you like, but I suspect that this is part of the bigger plot that's going on by 1485 to get Richard off the throne. Spreading misinformation, throwing a bit of dirt around. Because the other big one is that he planned to marry his niece, Elizabeth of York, who Henry VII ends up marrying.
I just can't see that at all.
No, I mean, and it's part of exactly the same thing. So he has to say, you know, I haven't killed my wife and I'm not going to marry my niece, which is pretty embarrassing for a king, and probably suggests that by this point Richard is struggling, because a king shouldn't be standing up in front of his people and trying to say, I haven't done this, I promise I'm not going to do that. So there's a sense there that things are unraveling for him already. The fact that he's having to stand in front of people and make these statements is far from ideal. And maybe he's struggling. His son's died, his wife's just died.
Awful.
Blood being slung around all over the place, that he's murdered his wife of 13 years, who he's probably grieving for. And then to add insult to injury, that he's the kind of monster who's going to marry his niece. I mean, in medieval times, they married cousins and stuff like that, maybe, but you didn't marry your niece.
No, I said to you earlier, even the Pope would have gone.
Yeah, I mean, that would have been considered beyond the pale and disgusting at the time. And he's being accused of this. And I think probably this comes out of, so we know when Anne dies, Richard enters into negotiations to marry a Portuguese or a Spanish princess.
Mm-hmm.
And his favoured bride seems to be Joanna of Portugal. And the one of the famous portraits in the Royal Portrait Collection is one that was painted to be sent to her to show her what Richard looked like. And part of those negotiations included a marriage for Elizabeth of York to one of the Portuguese royal family, who actually ends up becoming king. He wasn't in the direct line of succession, but events fall out that he ends up becoming king. So Elizabeth of York could have been Queen of Portugal in another world. And I wonder whether this isn't taking the fact that Richard is organising a Portuguese marriage for himself and a Portuguese marriage for his niece, and thinking we can make this sound really horrible if we talk about Richard around his niece. So it's kind of take this portion of truth and this portion of truth and make a lie out of them to discredit Richard. But it must have been pretty horrible for him to be forced to deny all of these things.
Yeah. And it must have been a bit grim for her as well, because, like, no offense to anybody that I'm related to, but just the thought was like, ew, I'm related to them. Can we just not go down that route? It's,
it's
she's a
proper
young girl, and for her to be caught up in that is, and her character besmirched, and
it's not good for her. A prince. She's a princess.
Yeah.
Her virginity and her moral reputation is everything. It's central to her ever being able to make a good marriage for herself. So she is being destroyed by this as much as Richard is.
That's it. It's like we're going to try and take one person down and everybody else is just collateral damage.
And so I think it's a charge, an accusation that's crafted out of a little fragment of truth, because we know that the Portuguese stuff was going on, and used against Richard. It's almost like these stories are twisted and then weaponized.
And I suppose if Richard had lived longer, that Portuguese match very possibly would have come into fruition. But obviously the story got stopped. So this is something that when I spoke to Mike Ingram a few weeks ago and we were talking about Richard and Bosworth, this is a question that I asked him. And I'm going to try, and when I spoke to Nathan the other week, we were actually speaking about the Beaufort line. So we stopped sort of like just before the bit where everyone kind of gets to with Edmund and everything like that. But I'm going to grab him for this question as well, because next time I talk to him, we're going to be talking about his new book and the Pretenders and things like that. So we're going to be
looking. You disagree with everything I've just told you.
Yeah, we're just going to be like, if people haven't come across any of these, there have been like articles and podcasts and all sorts of stuff with you guys kind of, and you're actually friends, aren't you? So but it's
I love Nathan. Nathan is absolutely brilliant. We disagree on everything from politics to the Princes in the Tower. But it's all we do it in a jovial way, I guess, but in a reasonable way. And it's part of the thing that bugs me about Richard III and the Tudors. There seems to be this perception that if you're into the Tudors, you have to hate Richard III, and if you're into Richard III, you have to hate the Tudors. And for me, you don't. They're all interesting for different reasons, and so Nathan and I disagree about everything, and he'll no doubt come on and say everything that Matthew said was complete and utter rubbish. Which is why I always like going second, so that I can say everything that Nathan said is completely
well, actually, I've been making notes on what you just said and here. So I might have to. But yes, if you ever come across anything, there's that. If you've got any links or anything like that for you guys, kind of, when I say pitched against each other, that sounds awful. It sounds like I'm trying to throw you into the ring for a wrestling match, and I don't mean it like that, but it's just great because you kind of have a really great chemistry with each other.
We're due to do a live discussion for the Battle of Bosworth anniversary, so they can't do the festival this year for obvious reasons. They're doing a remote version of the festival, and Nathan and I are due to go kind of head to head on the 22nd of August for that. So
perfect.
Website
I'm going to be there in the background rooting for you both. All right, so I will look forward to that. But so this is something I'm going to ask him as well. But obviously, Henry's been kind of in the background all the time in one place or another, and Edward was kind of leaning to maybe letting him come back, and it was just all a bit like this. So obviously Richard becomes king, and lots of people aren't impressed with this, and the Lancastrians have all but disappeared really as well. Everything's kind of dwindling, isn't it? In terms of heirs from both sides really, it's not as clear cut, and there's not as many contenders and things like that. But at what point do you think that Richard had to look at Henry and think, actually, what may have been something I needed to keep half an eye on is now something I've really got to take notice of and act upon, because it could potentially turn into something?
Bite me. I think that comes in the spring and summer of 1484. So we see him making preparations, and I think Richard expected Henry to invade in 1484. We know that Henry attempts a landing in October 1483 as part of what we call Buckingham's rebellions. I can talk to you for a couple of hours about those if you like. So we know that Henry attempts a landing on the south coast of England in October 1483. So Richard is aware at that point that he is involved in plots against Richard. Obviously, Christmas 1483, he makes this vow at Wren Cathedral to marry Elizabeth of York and get Richard off the throne. So I think it's pretty clear from early on that he is at least attempting to be a serious threat to Richard. And if you add to that who his mom is, Margaret Beaufort, she's a wealthy lady. She still has a lot of money. She's married to Thomas Stanley, who is influential at the centre of Yorkist government under Edward IV and under Richard III. Could talk a couple of hours about Thomas Stanley if you like. And I think it starts to become a little bit more serious in Richard's mind. I think there's preparations around in the summer as campaigning season approaches in 1484. I think Richard expects something then. And then by the time we get to the campaigning season of 1485, I think he's pretty sure that something is coming. We get all of these proclamations about Tudor, denigrating his background, so talking about him being, drawn from illegitimate lines and all this kind of things, really running him down, talking about him as our great rebel and all this sort of stuff, which is not something you do about someone who you're not worried about. So I think kind of Henry Tudor pops onto Richard's radar in October 1483. I think 1484, Richard is tentatively expecting an invasion from Henry Tudor, probably backed by the French. And in 1485, I think he's probably by that point pretty certain that something's coming.
Do you think, and this is obviously pure conjecture, or how do you think he would have felt going into that battle when it's imminent and there's all these things about the night before, he had omens and everything like that, but technically on numbers he stood to be the victor, and I think it came as a surprise to most people that wasn't the outcome of that situation. Yeah. And certainly, if the French hadn't have been involved, there would have been it would have been a non-starter. So do you think he was gravely concerned, or do you think he expected, I will live or die on the battlefield a king? I know I'm asking you an impossible question.
No. Because I think, again, this plays into, we need to remember that these people were real living human beings who were going through all of these things. So I don't think you can say that Richard was feeling one thing. I think he was probably feeling a really complex mix of all sorts of stuff. So we're in August 1485. It's only just over a year since his son's died and he's got no heir. It's only 7 months since his wife's died, his wife of 13 years. So his personal life has been falling apart for the last 18 months. And he hasn't remarried or produced another son yet. So those are still kind of fairly raw concerns that he has to have every day. He has this challenge to his throne, and he has to be worried about who is for him and who's against him. It's easy when there's no figurehead for people to gather around. They'll tend to stick with you because you're the king, and it's just not worth the effort of going out on their own. But as soon as this figurehead arrives, starts to gather a little bit of support, it's kind of like a centrifugal force, and it pulls in more and more and more supporters. So Richard has to be thinking, am I not a popular king then? I think if you look at some of Richard's policies in his brief reign, there was a lot there to praise and to be impressed by. But I think it detrimentally affected those in power, so the nobility and the gentry. So I think he's starting to realize maybe he's not a popular king in the way that he wanted to be. So people don't like him. We've got that issue about his scoliosis. So God has deigned to make me king of England, but now I have to face this threat to my throne. So is God withdrawing his support
Right.
for me? But at the same time as all of that, I think we can be fairly confident from the letters he writes from the hunting lodge at Bestwood when he gets the news that Henry Tudor has landed in Wales. He's excited because he wants the chance to face down this last threat. This is
I
the
guess
last
it's got to
vestige.
happen. It's got to happen. It's got to happen.
And he's been waiting for this. He's probably been waiting over a year, thinking, having this hanging over him, knowing that it's going to happen. It's going to come at some point. So it's finally here. Great. He's excited to deal with it. He's excited to put opposition to him to bed. He's excited to test himself before God again. Does God still approve of me? Because the outcomes of battle in the medieval mind were in the hands of God. So he's placing his claim to the throne of England before God again. And I think the Battle of Bosworth is the first occasion that we have since the Battle of Agincourt, when the King of England rides into battle with a crown on. So Henry V wore his crown at Agincourt. And I think that has a lot to do with placing the Lancastrian claim to the throne before God for judgment.
Right.
And I think Richard tries to do the same thing at Bosworth. And I think all of that, I either die a king or, I'm victorious this day. All of that, I'm not running away, is about saying, I'm going to be judged here.
Yeah.
And I'm not running away from that judgment. I'm going to face that judgment, and either God approves of me as King of England still, or he doesn't. He does know he's got the numerical advantage, but he's not sure what the Stanleys are going to do. And they definitely have the numbers to sway it.
Yeah.
If they move over to Henry's side, as he must have suspected they were going to, then that makes the numbers pretty much even, and maybe even a slight advantage for Henry. If they stay out of it, he's got the numbers on Henry. So his hope must have been that the Stanleys don't take part. And he also knows, he's experienced enough to know how unpredictable battle can be.
Yeah.
You talk about Agincourt, the numbers don't guarantee you anything. Any time that you step onto the field of battle, you're putting your life in God's hands. A stray arrow, falling off your horse and injuring yourself, getting caught out of position. You could have all of the numbers and the territorial advantage that you like and still lose the battle and be killed during it. So he knows, as he's putting his armor on that morning of the 22nd of August, 1485, he might die that day.
Yeah.
And he must know that. But he's excited. I think he has this mix of, my personal life is a bit rubbish at the moment. I want to be a great king who's loved by his people, but clearly I'm not. This is the last threat that I can see to my position, and I'm excited to face that. And I know I've got the numbers on this guy, and I believe I have the right on my side, and that God should be on my side. But today's also going to be unpredictable.
Just another thing that's just popped into my head is to put right a horse, my kingdom for a horse. Does not mean give me a horse so I can leg it.
Yeah.
No.
Even so, every single chronicle talks about Richard fighting bravely at Bosworth.
Yes.
And fighting manfully in the thickest press of his enemies, and quotes like that. Every single source. And then we get this idea that Shakespeare decides to paint Richard as a coward who calls for a horse to escape from the Battle of Bosworth. But even that isn't true, because what Shakespeare's Richard III does, he calls for a horse. He comes on to the stage and calling for a horse. And William Catesby says to him, "Oh yeah, I'll get you a horse so you can run away." And Richard says, "No, you idiot. I want a horse so I can get back into the fight." Yeah. And he says, "I've killed 6 people today that I thought were Henry Tudor. I want a horse to get back out there and find the 7th one until I find the real Henry Tudor and kill him."
Yeah.
So the horse, a horse, my kingdom for a horse, isn't a cowardly effort to escape the battlefield. It's a desperate bid to get back in there and carry on fighting.
Because even sources hostile to Richard from start to finish still speak of his bravery on battlefields, and that he'd always been a brave and effective soldier, and that he didn't shy away from anything at all. He went for it. He was going for it, and if that meant the end of him, then that meant the end of him. He felt that he had to. The decision with how it was going to go was with him. He wanted to do everything he could personally, whatever the cost was to him, to draw a line on this one way or the other. And
Yeah,
I feel, talking about obviously the psychology of the situations with what you just said, to him, it had to be him.
yeah.
He
He's
had
the
to,
king.
as much as possible, put himself in to be in or out.
Yeah, he's the king. Everything revolves around him.
Yeah.
If he runs away, he's not king anyway.
No,
Kings don't run away.
exactly. And it was just, and when, I mean, I love the medieval festival at Bosworth, and I'm so gutted. It's my favourite thing. I know compared to some things, it's not considered a huge thing, but it's my favourite thing. And I get to catch up with people, and I just love it. And the first time I went, which was years ago now, and they had the battle reenactment, and they started with the was it 1 or 2 minutes? They do the silence, don't
Yeah,
they?
2 minutes.
And I could see people kind of going like this, but then it's one of these things that dawns on you that just as we would have a respectful silence on Remembrance Day, which I think is quite right, these people were no different.
No, they died. People died on that field.
In hundreds and thousands in these battles. And they then left as well, destitute families.
And
Your
especially when
death on
you
the
think about,
battlefield could mean the death of your whole family because they would starve to death.
yeah, you think about things like the Battle of Towton, 1461. Huge battle, massive numbers talked about, and they talk about brother fighting brother, and people, whole families could be completely decimated. So if all the men die, there's no one to work. So and there's no social security. So the wives and the children, how do they survive? So it's the knock-on effect around the country of all of those people being killed during battles. And we tend to forget. We see the cannons going off and all look at the longbows firing, and the charges of the horses and all of that kind of stuff that's amazing to watch. It's kind of easy to get swept up in that and forget that people really did die.
Yeah, and it was
most of them didn't choose to be there. They were called up by their lord. They were required to go there. They might not have understood what the fight was for. They might not have supported the side that they were fighting for. They didn't really have much choice.
Because if you didn't go, they'd kill you anyway. So
you get kicked off your land and you die of starvation as well as your wife and children. So, they died for a cause they didn't necessarily understand or believe in, but they had no choice but to go there and die.
Yeah. And it was just, well, all war is brutal and horrific, but it was just literally, you would just get hacked to death. Yeah. Well, Richard got hacked to death. There was no, once you're on the battlefield, it doesn't matter who you are.
If you go back to the Battle of Towton, if you look at some of the bodies that they dug up from some of the mass graves they found after Towton, and they've done like a facial reconstruction on one of the skeletons, and he's got so many wounds on this guy's face. He's probably about my age, in his mid-40s, and they said there's healed wounds all over his face that mean his face must have been carved to pieces in previous battles over the last 20 years, and he's living with all of those scars, and he's turning up again. Have another crack at it.
Put off by any of this. He's rolled back out again.
It was pretty brutal.
Yeah, to say the least. And it's not something obviously that we can even comprehend.
No.
But it does prove that as we go through history, people are just horrible to each other. It's just they have to find different ways to be horrible to each other. One thing becomes unacceptable. So to gain money and power and wealth, you have to find another way to do it. And it's just, history is so different, but at the end, the periods in history are so different. But you go back and you analyse it, and the reasons people do things are pretty much the same.
This is it. This is why I'm interested in the human aspect of all of these stories, because human nature doesn't really change all that much.
It's like that thing, they had lots of children because their children were just going to die and they just accepted it. Well, yeah, they did accept it, but that doesn't mean that it didn't hurt.
Yeah.
And it wasn't crushing. We can't imagine, we're parents, it's your worst nightmare. Yeah. But just because infant mortality was it roughly at sort of 40%, I think?
It was crazily high.
Just because it was expected, that doesn't mean that it's not horrible.
No, and then it carries the extra risk that every pregnancy was so incredibly dangerous for a woman.
Yeah.
That you've got to have children to allow for the fact that they're not necessarily all going to survive. So you've got the heartbreak of carrying a baby that you don't know if it's going to survive, but you don't know if you're going to survive.
Yeah.
To have another one, or to see this child grow up.
Yeah, and
You
and
know,
class, and wealth didn't it didn't discriminate against those.
it was the great leveler. No matter, I mean, in some cases, wealthier ladies did worse in childbirth because of this idea that you should take to your bed several weeks before the birth and you don't move. And they hung tapestries around the walls. They blocked up all the windows. There was no draft, no fresh air. And they thought, a cold draft might be bad, but hot, stale, musty air that is full of germs with
Yeah,
no free air moving through it is just as bad. And then, the woman would stay in bed after the birth until she was churched, where women lower down the social scale would have a baby and get on with it. They had stuff to do, and so they didn't have all of this supposed luxury of taking to their beds and being surrounded by these tapestries in lovely warm rooms. But actually, in a lot of ways, that was worse for your health than
yeah. As somebody who's had 2 babies, I can tell you I wouldn't have been up for that.
yeah,
That would
yeah.
not have been my idea of a good time at all.
No,
Just
and rather than the local,
uncomfortable, and you just like want everyone to go away. And
yeah, and rather than a local midwife who knew what she's doing and delivered hundreds of babies, you get a room full of noble women who don't necessarily know what they're doing, and royal doctors being involved who aren't experts in childbirth.
I did hear a theory about that, and I could not tell you where it's come from. I've forgotten, but people reckon that's one of the reasons that Jane Seymour may have passed away, because she had all the best doctors,
Yeah, yeah,
and which is great, but they were not experienced in these matters. You'd have been better off, Queen or not, to go down the road and find 2 or 3 experienced midwives.
yeah.
It doesn't mean that they could have
No,
prevented. I mean,
but the
they
male
might
royal
have
doctors.
noticed that she may, if part of the placenta, for example, had been retained, they'd have known that.
Yeah,
Whereas
and
these guys were like, oh, baby's come out, right, off we go.
job done.
Yeah, hooray, it's a
Thanks for the
boy,
Queen.
let's go and get drunk.
Yeah.
So one last question for you, even though I have 10,000.
Okay.
Okay. In terms of, you have been involved, I believe, in looking for ways to educate younger people about not just Richard, but his, I mean, specifically about Richard, but this sort of broadens widely. How should we engage younger people into history, do you think?
I think
That's a horrible question.
no, it's a really good question. It's an important question. It's a question we probably don't think about enough. I think we've kind of fallen into a trap where the history curriculum has become the same thing over and over and over and over again. We do the Tudors, Victorians, the World Wars, and I think that creates a really narrow view of what history is. I mean, how many children at secondary school could reel off the list of kings from the conquest to today? Just because every period of history is surrounded by the context of everything that went before,
Yeah,
and the
yeah.
people who were living it. I think unless you understand the broad sweep of history, it's hard to understand the place of specific events in that history. And I think rather than thinking about what subjects we teach, so we teach the Tudors, the Victorians, the World Wars, should we talk about the Wars of the Roses more? I almost think the subject that you teach doesn't matter. I loved history at A level because I had a history teacher who taught us the Wars of the Roses and loved the Wars of the Roses.
Yeah.
It was her thing and she loved it. And that was so obvious in the way that she taught us, that enthusiasm is infectious and it sticks. So I think, for me, I would let teachers teach whatever period of history they want to teach, whatever they're interested in. So if I was going to be a history teacher, I'd teach the Wars of the Roses. Someone else could go and teach the Tudors. Someone else might teach Henry III. Virtually no one knows anything about Henry III. Actually, incredibly interesting bloke. But I think it's more about the skills that we teach children when they study history. So at university, I did a law degree. And I used to do some work experience at a local solicitor's office. And I always remember one of the solicitors there telling me that there isn't a solicitor in the world who knows all of the law.
Yeah.
The trick is to know where to go and find what you need.
Okay. Yeah.
Which book do you look in? Where do you start doing your research? How do you structure an argument? How do you examine events and try to understand why they happened as well as how they happened? And I think those are skills that directly apply to history as well. So in an age of fake news and all of that kind of stuff, it has never been more important to be able to teach children to question what they read. Again, it comes back to who is writing this, when are they writing it, why are they writing it, why do they want you to hear this story? And I think unless you start questioning all of those things, you're never going to understand history, because history can just be a boring set of dates on a document.
Which is what it used to be, I think. That's like the stereotype, isn't it?
Yeah. The interest is how and why did those events end up on that document? Why did that person choose to do it that way? And I think unless you start questioning what you read, and those are just skills that you can use in anything, you know, that applies to studying the law and it applies to studying history. A lot of the ways that I approach my history books, which hopefully is good, I don't know, but is based on my experience of learning the law, because they're all transferable skills and they're valuable skills in everyday life. Even if you don't go on to be a historian, it's important to be able to question what you're hearing and to understand why things have happened. So I kind of think if it was me, if I was education secretary, I'd say to teachers, teach whatever events you want, but at the end of the course, these are the skills that we want your students to have about researching, about questioning, about understanding what makes a good source, what makes a bad source, how you can extract good from a bad source, because lots of sources aren't all bad. The most biased source in the world can still have factual information in it. But teach students to question what they read and to understand why things happen the way they happen.
That sounds like a fundamental piece of coursework right there.
There you go.
Yeah. But it's true. It's very easy to just, and as we were saying before we started, you know, history again, with the way it was taught was this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened. That's what happened.
Yeah.
And
I think it used to be reciting history verbatim and learning dates, you know, 1066 and all of that. And I think it's almost slipped too far the other way, where nobody has that broad sweep of history. They know a lot about the Tudors, or they study World War II, but it's all kind of completely out of context with the rest of the world and the period that led up to that, because they can't place it in the context of everything else that was going on in the 100 years before that. You know, we talk about the Wars of the Roses, and most people will talk about it starting in almost a century earlier.
Yeah.
You know, with all the problems with France and the 100 Years' War, and then the, you know, deposition of Richard II and all of that kind of thing. All of that has to play into your study of the Wars of the Roses. And so it's understanding how you arrived at those events. And like I say, I think it's less important which specific period of history you learn about than the skills that you learn about how do I approach understanding something.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. It almost feels like if someone does a history degree, you might want to specialize, but possibly at least your first year should just be history.
Yeah.
Very
and world history. You know, we
Yeah.
have a horrible tendency in this country, I think, to study English history almost in isolation, with the exception maybe of when you get to the world wars, obviously. But we view our own history out of context with the history of the rest of the world a lot of the time, and we have quite a distorted view of our own history that needs questioning.
Yeah.
Some of it is good, some of it is just plain wrong, and people tend to take offence if you want to challenge this long-standing view of British and English history, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't challenge it.
Absolutely.
And yeah, you know, I think one of the most interesting things I saw a while ago was someone talking about there needs to be a big project and a book about the British Empire that talks about how we arrived at having an empire and the good impact that it undoubtedly had on British life and on parts of the world, but in parallel the bad aspects of it and the damage that it did all over the place. And not that you can't talk about the good things because of the bad things, but if you don't know about the bad things and you think the British Empire was only good, you have a really distorted view of what went on in history, because very few things are purely good or purely bad.
No, that's it. And obviously, you know, we look at some of the things that happened and they were horrific, but actually for a large number of people, life was good.
Yeah.
And therefore there were their motivations to continue doing the things they did. And sometimes people do things that seem hideous, but for whatever reason or reasons, some people genuinely don't realize the impact of what they're doing. That's not an excuse, but you know, they're not far reaching or worldly enough or whatever. People are so, in any one situation on a grand scheme like that, you're going to have so many different people, personalities, IQs, individual experiences. You know, it's it can go on forever.
Yeah, I think we still have a really strong slant on British history that is still really heavily influenced by the late Victorian historians who were watching the almost coming to the end of the British Empire and were wanting to prevent that and hark back to what they thought were better days.
Yeah, better for them.
Well, yeah, better for them, absolutely.
Else.
but I think we're still trapped by that a little bit, by that view of Britannia and the empire as a civilizing force for good around the world.
Yeah.
That, you know, didn't do any harm anywhere. Undoubtedly, it did many, many positive things, but there's a cost to that.
Yeah.
That you can't ignore.
I think if I talk about that too much, I'm going to get myself into trouble. So that might be a point to leave it for this time. Thank you so much. This has been wonderful.
Thank you for having me.
It's just so much to think about and take in, because some of it obviously I know, but again, just new theories, new ideas, things that I didn't know, things that were going to, just in case there wasn't enough stuff in my brain already, now I have some more stuff, so that's real positive. But I know that you're very busy, so thank you so much for your time. But I will definitely catch up with you and everybody, and I will remind everybody, 22nd of August, it's going to be good. Fetch the popcorn, fetch the popcorn, because that's going to be a brilliant one. But thank you so much, and take care of yourself, and hope you will speak again soon.
Definitely.
Bye.